Hello, greetings. Welcome to the National Resource Center, Mass Communication and Journalism Department of Tezpur University in Assam. And I am Sisir Basu from the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, Banaras Hindu University, Varanasi. And today our topic of discussion would be strands of communication studies. We will be a little historical. We will try to find out as to when the discipline of communication started as a subject and how it has progressed and where it is standing now. You see, communication as a concept was since the beginning of human civilization. Even our forefathers, they were speaking, they were communicating, they understood the importance of communication. But communication as a discipline, as an area of study, as a subject like philosophy, like English, physics, it is of recent origin. It just started during Second World War. And just to give you a background as to how it has begun, during the Second World War, United States of America was not involved in the war. The war was taking place in Europe, and in both the sides of America, you have on the eastern side it is Atlantic Ocean, and on the western side you had Pacific Ocean. So it was well guarded, it was safeguarded, and so the American people never wanted America to get involved in the war. And the people from the Western European countries, since they were attacked by Nazi forces, they wanted some help from America, so they were appealing for help. That was another side. And the third one is that the Nazi soldiers were mowing down all other countries that were opposing it. So you have three-pronged thing. One is that the citizens of America never wanted America to get involved. Western European countries wanted America to get involved and appeal to it for help. And the third one was you have another sector which was mowing down the people in the Western European countries. So they had a problem. Now in 1941, America decided that they should respond to the appeal that was happening. So they had a task cut out for them. One was that they had to convince, that is the Washington, the capital had to convince the American people that the war is to be fought. That means America should get involved, and some assurance was to be given to the Western European countries that we are coming, we are going to help you. And the third one was that some sort of threatening was to be given to the Nazi soldiers. So for that, in Washington, the power that be gathered many experts from social sciences, from agriculture, from engineering and all, and asked them to advise as to how to proceed with the war. And for that, Washington constituted 4 committees. One was Division of Information and Education. The second one was Survey Division of the Office of War Information. The third one was US Department of Agriculture, and the last one was the Office of Facts and Figures. Now these 4 committees were together helping the powers that be in Washington formulating strategy and how to proceed with the war so that they would be able to win over the Nazi soldiers. Now one particular committee, that is the Office of Facts and Figure, was headed by someone called Wilbur Sham, which you must have come to know. And he was particularly interested in communication because he saw that all these committees that were working on on strategy, one thing was very sure, that communication was the key issue that was to be focused on to win the war. Why? Number one, American citizens were to be communicated that it was proper for America to get involved in the war. Secondly, through communication only they could assured the Allied forces that they were coming and helping them out, and the third one was the enemy soldiers were to be threatened. So communication was all pervading, communication was very important. So Wilbur Schramm, while working with other social scientists and other scholars, thought that communication was surfacing to be a key issue, a key concept. So after the Second World War, what happened is that he went back to Iowa University from where he came. He was running a kind of workshop for the writers there. Remember that Wilbur Schramm had BA in political science and social sciences, MA in English literature, and PhD in American studies. So he was well grounded in broad humanities studies, and he thought that communication was related to the human beings, to the society, and therefore this was to be given priority and importance. So what he did in Iowa, he started a Department of Communication. A journalism program was already there. Then from there he moved on to Wisconsin in 1947, and he started a PhD program in communication. Then he moved to Minnesota in 1951 and started a program there. And at the end he went to Stanford in 1952, where he started a course on communication. So by 1952-53, there were many university departments where communication studies began with the help of Wilbur Schramm. Now Wilbur Schramm was someone who was working with missionary zeal. He was moving from one place to the other, inviting the scholars from social sciences and humanities to look into the problems of communication or research on communication. He himself was writing books, writing booklets, writing articles, and impressing upon others to work in the area of communication. So what you have is Wilbur Schramm. He was almost working like a coordinator, bringing in various talents together and asking them to work in the field of communication. From here you can see that people from different backgrounds, psychology, anthropology, sociology, physics, and engineering, so they all came and looked into communication. What is beauty of this coming together is that everybody came to study communication with a kind of perspective from their own mother discipline. And that's why in the beginning, when we talk about various models and theories of communication, you will see that people from various background. Laswell was from political science, so he came up with his who says what to whom with what effect, that kind of model. You have people who are with psychology, with attitude change, like Hovland. He talked about attitude change theories. Then you have people like Everett Rogers. Of course, Everett Rogers is much younger, but he was a rural sociologist who came up with his theory and a book called Diffusion of Innovation. In fact, he worked with 508 research studies, put them together, had a meta-analysis, and came up with his theory and the book. This is so far we talk about the transmission model, because everything dependent on from a center to the receiver through linear motion. And all the models that you see during this time, they were of similar in nature, starting from a center, going to the receiver through various steps. Now, this was a kind of a strand that we talk of, that it was Second World War, Wilbur Schramm strand. But was there any communication study before Second World War? And if we study history, we will find that someone called Blair, who who was Daddy Blair? He is known, actually his name is Willard Blair. He was a professor of English in the Department of English in Kansas University. He came from a family, that family had people who were into journalism. And while he was teaching English, he thought that his students should be trained in the skill of writing, so that after the course is over in English, they would be able to go to the newspaper and practice journalism. So they needed some sort of a skill training. That's how he started in 1903 a course in journalism. Now his own students from that department, Kansas University department, went to other universities and established the same kind of program. And since he had many students who went out and did a lot of work in the area of journalism, and they became teachers of journalism, that's why it is said that he is the daddy, he is the father of that, and he is known as Daddy Blair. So Daddy Blair, Blair and the institution of journalism was another strand. So that's another part of history. Was there anything else? If we dig into history, we will see that Rockefeller Foundation was into communication much before the Second World War. Now, if we see that why Rockefeller Foundation, Rockefeller Company was into oil business, but at that time Rockefeller put aside some money because they were making a lot of profit from the oil business. So they thought that they should give back something to the society, and that's why there was a Department of Humanities, and that was headed by someone called John Marshall. John Marshall was interested in many research studies, and particularly in the area of radio programs. His intention was whether radio could be used for the education purposes. So, because you remember that radio it was in its heyday during that time, 1920s, 1930s, radio was very, very powerful and very popular. So John Marshall gave a lot of funding to do studies in radio programs, in the impact of radio, and how radio program could impart education. And John Marshall was also involved in one group that is called Communications Seminar during 30s in New York, where he used to call people who were in communication, asking them to come and present their findings, conduct research, and share their ideas. And this communication seminar, I think, was the first time which used the word communication instead of journalism. And it stayed on, because there were many people who came together there to work with him in the area of radio, in the area of communication. It was some sort of a preparation for the Washington days later on in 1941, 42, 43, 44 and 45 till the war ended. So Rockefeller Foundation contributed immensely in the area of communication study, because they funded many projects which studied radio. They also funded a lot of seminars where people were able to share their ideas, share their findings, and encourage each other to get into communication. Now, so this is another strand. So we have talked so far about Wilbraham and his contribution. We talked about Willard Blair, who is popularly known as Daddy Blair, and his contribution. Then we talked about Rockefeller Foundation's contribution, because they were there since 20s through 30s, and later on also they contributed immensely in research in radio and in media in general. Now, if we take these three strands out, or three broad areas, steps, where communication studies were being done and communication was being established as a discipline. We move on to something called Frankfurt School. Now this is European tradition. Now what is Frankfurt School? If we remember that Karl Marx came up with his Communist Manifesto in 1848, in which he said that proletariat, that means the working class or the labor class, will have to organize themselves in order to dislodge from power the bourgeoisie. That means those who are in the position of power, since they were exploiting the workers, they are to be dislodged from power, they should be removed from power through revolution if the proletariat, that means the laborers, organize themselves, be together and fight. So there were many skirmishes, there were many battles in Europe during the 19th century. But most of the places they faced defeat because they couldn't shape up to the power of the powerful, those who were in power at that time, like the kings, queens and the nobles. The only successful case which followed the doctrine of Marx was the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia under Lenin. And this alarmed the European powers, and people wanted to know how that happened. Felix Well was a son of a wheat merchant who amassed a lot of money from the wheat business which his father was doing with Argentina and South American countries. So he thought that why not to establish an institute which will look into this, and then he funded that one, and that institute is known as the Institute of Social Research, affiliated to Frankfurt University at that time. Now what were they to do? They were to find out how Bolshevik Revolution was successful, how Marx's doctrine helped people to organize, and what may happen at the end in Europe. So this was 1922-23. So in Europe these things were happening, but by the time they came to 1930, the first director of that school, Karl Grunberg, had a stroke and he had to retire. Max Horkheimer was someone who succeeded, and their first thing was to look into the positivism. The positivism, usually that is what we use in our communication research, influenced heavily by the physical sciences methodology in research. So Horkheimer was not so happy with positivism, so he critically assessed that one, came up with his own version. In fact, in his opening lecture, he criticized heavily this positivism. Together with him, there were Adorno, there were Marcuse, and some others who were working together. But remember that 1931-32 already the Nazi, that is in Germany, Hitler came to power and he was driving away all the scholars who were Jewish in origin. And in Frankfurt School, fortunately or unfortunately, all the scholars were Jews. So they had to leave and they went to America, and in America they found some space in many universities rather, and Columbia University was the one who sheltered them, and they started to work on communication in America. So that's how they came up with the cultural industry and commodification of the product, the television programs and films and all. So this is another strand that we have. Frankfurt School contributed, but it is not mentioned much. We still, by and large in the world, we follow the American school of thought, one that I have just discussed. Frankfurt School was limited in the beginning in in Europe and later on to America, but now Frankfurt School, the importance of Frankfurt School and their contribution has spread around the world. Now, after Frankfurt School, what we have is another strand that is called the cultural studies. Now, remember that during the Second World War, there was after the Second World War, there was a lot of turmoil around the world. There was, leftist movement, the socialist movement, and also the American propaganda went with it. The world was divided into two camps. One was headed by USA, the other one was headed by USSR, and both the groups, they resorted to propaganda tactics to win over as many countries as possible under them. And propaganda was something that was based in communication. You have radio broadcast, you have all kinds of books coming out, you have all kinds of films being made. So these were the communication material that were studied during that time. And media products became very important. 60s was a time when there was a lot of movement, particularly the students' movement around the world and in Europe. So there was a person who wanted to study this movement and also television, radio and film. And he is Stuart Hall. And he went there from West Indies, went to London in Oxford University to do his studies in English literature. In fact, he was a Rhodes Scholar, but after some time he was taken over by this movement. So he left his studies in Oxford and joined many of this movement, and also started doing his academic work like evaluating, writing about television programs, about culture, about films, and about identity, representations, and all these topics came up during that time. Richard Hogarth went to Birmingham University and established a school of cultural studies in Birmingham, and he took Stuart Hall with him, and both of them started a new area of studies called cultural studies, and mostly they were focusing on media. After some time, Richard Hogarth left, and Stuart Hall took over the directorship, and he had a new approach to research and conducting research. Like he would constitute a team and would take up a problem, and all of them contribute in doing that kind of research. So Stuart Hall and the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies Institute or Center for Cultural Studies contributed immensely in the area of communication studies. So this was another strand. The Birmingham School in Birmingham University, a Center for Cultural Studies was established, and for a long period of time it continued till in this century, in I think the first half of this first decade, this was stopped. So that cultural study now does not exist in Birmingham, but such schools have spread around the world. You have in the USA, you have a lot of centers, a lot of departments of cultural studies in Canada, in the Oceania like Australia and New Zealand, and in India also we have many universities where there are Center for Cultural Studies established, and we have many scholars, many books, many research studies done on cultural aspect by the scholars working there. So, so far we have talked about this strand of Blair, strand of Wilbraham, then we talked about Rockefeller Foundation's contribution, then we talked about Frankfurt School, and at the end we were discussing about Stuart Hall, Richard Hogarth, and the Center for Cultural Studies at Birmingham University. Now, these are the 5 major strands that contributed immensely to the development of communication studies or communication as a discipline. In the 80s, early 80s, there was a lot of churning that was going on around the world, particularly among the scholars of communication. All of you must be aware of the Journal of Communication. A special issue came up in 1983. 41 scholars contributed their articles, in which many of these scholars question the discipline, the scholarship, the quality of research, and the direction of the discipline. So there was a lot of soul searching among these scholars in the world. Remember that out of these 41 scholars, 9 were only non-Americans. That means they were either from Europe or from third world countries. The rest of them, that is 32 of them, were from United States of America, and they themselves were questioning the model that they have followed, the effect study or the transmission model that they adhered to and then they propagated. So there was a lot of soul searching, there was a lot of discussion about the kind of direction that communication took forth. There was a debate whether it should be only training or there should be education. There was training versus education, skill versus art, technology versus society determinism. So a lot of questions that came up as to how to design the syllabus that would help the students to answer the problems that they were facing currently. Then after 10 years, the Journal of Communication came up with another special issue that was with title The Future of the Field, in which they went back to the ferment in the field and they re-evaluated, and also some of them noted the changes that has come about. In many communication studies program, a lot of cultural studies, critical studies were taken in, and this is there was a change. And again, in the year 2008, the Journal of Communication came up with another special issue called Intersections. So if we follow all these strands, I think the ferment in the field or the Journal of Communication will also have to be considered, taken into consideration as to how it has helped the communication discipline to grow. First in 1983, the ferment in the field, then in 1993, the future of the field, and in 2008, intersection. All these 3 special issues talked about the nature of the discipline, the kind of research studies that were conducted, and where it was heading. Now, during this time or in these 3 major issues, they have shown that communication has grown more laterally and not vertically, creating many isolated area, niche area of specialization without having a link vertically. They said, if we summarize, then in the articles you will find that the discipline of communication has borrowed more from others and exported very little to the others. It also said that we are not reading our own work. That means our scholars are not reading the work of the other scholars from the field. Then how can we impress on others to read our work, our research? Carl Nordestrom, he is from Europe, he said that it is a field rather than a discipline. That means it has to grow further in order to become a discipline. Some of the people have mentioned that this is a design science, communication as a design science. That means producing human skills, and it is instrumental kind of knowledge that it is producing. Now, if we look to our own thing, to our own country, in India, we also have communication studies coming up in 1920s. Annie Besant started the first journalism course in Madras in 1920. Then broadly speaking, we know Hislop College's contribution, that was in Nagpur. American missionaries started a course there. Then famous Professor P.P. Singh started a course of journalism in 1941 in Punjab University. At that time it was located in Lahore. Then we have many other universities coming up with the program after the independence, that is after 1947. Many of these programs were evening programs or in the form of diploma or postgraduate diploma. Over a period of time, we are able to establish our discipline around the country. We have many central universities, state universities and institutes providing, offering courses in journalism and mass communication. We also have debate whether it is journalism and mass communication, communication or journalism. Nomenclature has been a problem in the US also. Nomenclature is also our problem. Some departments are known as communication, some are mass communication and journalism, some are journalism and mass communication. But we are all together moving forward, trying to incorporate the new things that are coming to our discipline. And this is how we have covered almost a century. We are going to celebrate 100 years of communication education in India from 1920 to 2020, and I am sure we must all be very positive in our thinking, because we have travelled a long road. We have still to go a long way, but I am sure we have done well so far. So the strands of communication education that I began with will have to be kept in mind. Then we will know how we have started and how we have moved forward, and how we need to course correction, as we say, how to do our course correction to move forward very positively and establish this discipline of communication as one of the primary disciplines in the area of studies in universities and institutes. Thank you.